My guest today is Joe Henrich, professor and chair of human evolutionary biology at Harvard University. Joe has written two incredibly important books, The Secret of Our Success and The Weirdest People in the World, How the West Became Psychologically Peculiar and Particularly Prosperous. The volume of these ideas in these two works is really incredible. So let's see what we can get through today. Joe, welcome.
All right. Thanks. Good to be with you, David.
So the philosopher Peter Winch says an anthropologist studying a people wishes to make those beliefs and practices intelligible to his or her readers. My reading is you take actually a fairly different implicit philosophical position. If you're familiar with Winch, you can tell me if you think that's right in your work. But do you agree with that statement? And if so, how might you approach this question differently than other anthropologists?
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is I don't know Winch's work, but I do. I mean, that's a common sentiment within the field, and it's actually a sentiment that I hold as a kind of a first step. So, I mean, we do want to try to convey how diverse populations feel and think, and that's one of the reasons I've made such an effort to incorporate more quantitative methods into my efforts. So you could do that through qualitative ethnography and through thick description of people's social lives, but then you can enrich that with using lots of data, lots of tools from cognitive psychology, social psychology, behavioral economics, and other places to get the kinds of measurements that allow us to compare across diverse societies.
Winch, he's got a funny kind of like take on this, where he very much says that in order to really understand a culture, which I think that if I think of anthropology, that's one way of thinking about it, right? You really have to work within that culture. So in a few instances in your works, you'll make a point something like this, where you'll observe some institution which has emerged inside of one of these societies, and it'll be kind of weird. It'll be different than the societies around them, and you'll say something along the lines of, "It's not clear to me that they themselves really understand what the outcome is of this." And it's on that point that Winch would turn away, and he would say, well, without being able to understand what they really think is going on, it's hard to really understand yourself what's really going on. And his kind of view, I think, I mean, he's passed away for a little while now, but would be that you're actually an ethnographer of our culture, looking at other cultures for inspiration and understanding better how we are today. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I do think there is a role for this idea of reflection. So when you see the diversity across human societies and also what's the same, it does give you more insight. Because one of our tendencies, I think, and probably as humans, but certainly as weird people, is to assume that the way our lives are is kind of the standard way that humans are, rather than being a particularly unusual way of thinking or a particularly unusual way of living. So, that's an important contrast, and that's one of the great things about anthropology that drew me to it, is that it's kind of the fish out of water, or the stark contrast that gets set up when you put yourself into a very different place than where you've grown up. But then I think, with lots of the methods we have now, we can get further into that and determine how people do think about that institution, whether it's through various kinds of vignette experiments or just in-depth interviewing, or lots of different methods to get at it. But you really need to tackle it with all the available methods from the social and natural sciences, and not just assume you have to use the standard ethnographic toolbox.
What is it that you get with those other tools? Do you get a deeper understanding, or is there something else?
Well, what you get is a deeper understanding, from a different perspective, and a measuring tool that allows you to compare across societies.
Okay. And can you give me an example of something you've measured across societies that's been educational?
I mean, the thing that I started to cut my teeth on was measuring people's fairness towards strangers. So societies vary, and there's lots of context-specific norms, which you can find pro-sociality in every society. But what turns out to vary a lot with markets or with pro-social religions is this willingness to be fair towards strangers. So people you don't know and might be anonymous, and you won't see again. So using these tools for behavioral economics, I think we have a way of kind of getting at that. And then you can correlate that with other kinds of real-world behaviors, whether it be markets or voluntary blood donations or other kinds of things that occur in the real world that allow you to connect the behavioral experiments to actual behavior.
And these methods would be alien to call it a traditional anthropologist that would have taught your undergrad courses?
I hadn't heard of an anthropology until the late 90s, when we started to build teams and get together with behavioral economists. But I mean, some of them have been published in the lead journals now in anthropology, but this is very far from the standard toolkit, and your average cultural anthropologist doesn't know much about it at all.
So what were they doing?
It's a pretty interesting trajectory, because if you go back to the father of American anthropology, so Franz Boas, Margaret Mead and others of that school began to introduce methods. So, and also in the British school, so W.H.R. Rivers started using tools from cognitive psychology to measure things like color perception across society. Margaret Mead used child's drawings and coded them, and some formal methods. But then gradually, by the time, as you're getting to the 1970s and 1980s, anthropologists are really turning to pure ethnography. So you're just supposed to kind of hang out, do long interviews with people, and draw your conclusion through some self-reflective process. And they draw, in the 1960s, anthropologists were teaming up with psychologists to look at visual illusions. But then that was all gone by the 1980s. And so then in the 2000s, late 90s, we start to begin to reintroduce tools.
Was there something that call it ethnography? I guess it's like I've read a couple of mid 20th century anthropologists, Mary Douglas, one for example, I think you cite in your work, and the book I read of hers, a couple books of hers, I don't want to call it rambling because it's not really. It's coherent, right? And it's continually making points. But there's definitely a stylistic there's a flavor to it, which I have not seen anywhere else. It's in some. I would find it in some sense almost dense. But there is a lot of ideas, but they kind of like come at them from many different angles. Like it's verbose. But there's definitely a style there. There's a style there, right? And I'm wondering like, what are the strengths of that? Like, do we lose something by losing that style? Like, was there something that they were really good at by doing that is kind of fading away a little bit?
Well, I don't know if it's fading away, but I do think that there is a tendency to kind of want to be either qualitative or quantitative. And the line that I've always taken since graduate school is, you can get in there and do the rich ethnography and learn the language and live there for a long time and get a real feel for the texture of people's lives. And that doesn't mean you can't also do all of the experimentation and the systematic interviews and stuff. I mean, there's not really a trade-off here too much. I mean, there's a little bit of trade-off in terms of time. But, when you're doing the sort of systematic interviews of the kind I did among the Mapuche or with the Machiganga, you're still experiencing life. You're getting to someone's house. You're seeing what it looks like inside. You're maybe having lunch with them after, or, at least watching how their household runs while you're there.
Yeah, if I think about like one other thing about that, and I think come back to Winch for another second, and considering what I think of as the kind of highly narrative form of anthropology, like it seems that there's not a systematic way for analyzing change in there. And it's definitely, to call that something that you've been focused on is a little bit of an understatement. But this absence of an idea of like an evolutionary concept, I suppose, it's just not there. And I had an interview with another philosopher called Agnes Callard, and she has this whole book on the philosophy of aspiration and how kind of like really hard it is for a philosopher to wrap their head around this idea of somebody wanting to adopt a different value system, right, or change their value system, which is literally changing culture, right, which is actually entirely what you study. And so it feels to me like the philosophical approach to these kinds of problems is missing something you would probably say completely foundational, right? And I'm wondering maybe you can talk a bit about why cultures change, or maybe if you can reflect on kind of what we might be missing there. But what is the underlying kind of like need for this process inside of us?
Well, so, the way I anchor it is very much if we think about so humans are a cultural species, and if you compare us to other primates that are closely related primates, what we're really good at is learning from other people. So from a young age, young children come into the world and they're keying in certain members of their social group. And I've argued that we have lots of cues that we use to figure out who to pay attention to. And we're learning things like, well, what should one be? What does one aspire to be? What are the kinds of things one could be? How should one think? What are the heuristics one should use? What's a good solution to a problem? What's a valuable life, or what's a valuable skill? And we're acquiring all that stuff and bootstrapping up our own abilities. Once you learn what the valuable things are, the valuable ways to be in a society, you can then, work on your own on perfecting those skills and stuff. But it's really socially learning that tells us what competencies we should have.
Are you drawing a link, if I understand this right, if I'm making this up, but a link between the idea of socialization, so kids becoming part of a culture, is itself a kind of evolution, right? Is it sort of remade inside of each child in a whole new different kind of way, and eventually they assimilate into the larger culture? Is that a way you think about it?
Well, that's the foundation of cultural evolution, is the idea that children they come into the world geared to learn.
Right.
And it's that flow of learning from one generation to the next. So a single child may learn from lots of people, but then you have another generation that has learned all the stuff from the prior generation, and it's tracking that change over time across generations that is the meat of cultural evolution.
I think about like this, I call it mimetic process, right? So that's not really a word that you use in that way, but right, it's a word that's out there for related ideas as being a pretty conservative one, right? So to me, your fidelity to the learning process is related to your ability to actually just recreate the process inside your head, or recreate the cultural outcome inside your head, right? So it's designed, all these institutions, or even kind of like psychological, biological mechanisms that are making us want to do this, make us want to be like everybody else. So that to me is like a very conservative, in the sense of conserving what happened before, process. And yet we have change. Right. So how do we square that up?
The great thing about that observation is that that's kind of built into these cultural evolution models. So under some conditions, you'll create stability. But if you have a condition where the people who are succeeding, being successful, gaining prestige in society are very different from the average person, then people are going to tend to copy those, and that's going to cause the entire society to shift in that direction. Or, as happens in a lot of contact between society situations, you have people copying the members of another group, whether it be language or hairstyles or music styles or economic practices. And then you get a quick change or a relatively faster change in a society because they're copying an outside society, because that society seems more interesting, more successful, whatever the relevant cues are.
You know what's neat about that is I'm getting the sense that it may be in your concept, and you can react since you're here, there isn't really any hard boundaries between cultures, right? So there's kind of overlapping, and there's these borderlands where they're influencing each other all the time. And so I imagine it'd be you might be hard pressed to draw kind of an outline around these people are in this culture and these people are in those cultures, and they're all different.
Yeah, and that's, I think, one of the ideas that really makes cultural evolution as we think of it now in the 21st century different from how anthropologists and others thought of it in the 20th century, is that it's a statistical concept, right? So take any cultural trait and a slice in time, and there'll be a statistical distribution of a certain cultural trait. The same way you could do that for height or something like that, a physical trait. And then what you're doing is tracking that distribution over time and looking at the forces that change it. But it's individual, something you can measure at the individual level, but at the group level, it only exists as a statistical distribution. Now, that could be a very stable trait, because there could be lots of reasons why a trait will remain stable or only change slowly. So that it could have a kind of endurance through time. It might be interconnected with other traits that help make it stable, so they form a package. So things like kin-based institutions will do that. Rituals will do that. So there is plenty of room for stability, but you can also get this rapid change if you have outgroups or ecological shifts or things like that.
And so this idea of cultures actually being distinct from each other, you use statistical concept. I like that. So there's like, with some probability you're part of this culture or that culture, but it's never probably 100% because it's always a little bit different. So that, if I think back again to the philosophers I mentioned earlier, their kind of conceptual error, if I could use that strong of a term, is actually to pretend that there are differences. So there is you're in culture A or culture B, and in that world, you introduce the problem of, well, would you ever transition away from culture A? Well, you're constantly in transition, right? Cultures are always moving around, even by small increments.
And one of the kind of disciplines I impose upon my graduate students is whenever they give me a draft paper and they use the word cultures as a noun, I cross it out and I write populations.
Okay, right.
About a population that currently has a distribution of various culture traits, but it's not, because the word culture essentializes the group, and it makes it seem like it's a stable thing that we have to identify in the world, rather than a statistical distribution that can, in principle, be changing through time, but may be stable for various reasons.
Right, so it's a bundle of traits. Can you measure that? I mean, you back to the measurement point, like, I guess, how would you measure these traits? Like, is there a quantification of the idea of culture? Can you make it literally statistical?
Yeah, well, and we do. So you do it. You could do it through interviews. You could do it through observation. So how do people do a certain thing? And, everybody's going to do it a little bit differently within the society, but they might all make a fire in a similar way with slightly different protocols or something like that. One of the things I've studied is taboos that women hold during breastfeeding
okay.
And you can ask women what are taboos, what are the taboos on breastfeeding, and you'll go through a list and you'll get a vector of ones and zeros.
Right.
And then not every woman has the same ones and zeros, but many of them have the same ones and zeros. So you can then characterize the distribution.
Right. So this is interviews. It seems to me like quite a I work these days in the software business where the concept of actually asking people things and then writing them down is like horrifying, right? Because they want everything automated and scalable and all the rest of that. But maybe there isn't such a thing. So there isn't a way to, scale the measurement of culture, to your knowledge?
Well, I mean, we are doing that now. So colleagues who do big data that are interested in these ideas will use like people's Facebook likes or, the information that people provide in various online forums, or they'll, do some natural language processing on blogs or something like that to try to get the kind of cultural data that I go with a bunch of interviewers and a team of Fijians and gather on the islands in the remote part of the Pacific, where, that kind of electronic data is just not available.
Yeah, so do you track quantities of change in culture? Like, is there, what would the concept of that be?
Well, so for example, you could look at that same thing I measured through time, so across generations. So one of the things I'll do with just a single measurement is look at younger folks versus older folks and see if that's changing, or variation among villages. Or in principle, I could do it, 10 years later. So one of the things we study is we look at the World Values Survey, and we can see how culture changes, at least as reported in the values in the World Values Survey, for a particular region over time. And you can see changes there because that's been done now since 1980. So we have, 40 years of data on that.
How about these? I think of like to me, that the social components of culture, it looks like there's or of the model of it, there's this tension between the conservatism versus the innovation, right? So I was mentioning earlier that I think of the mimetic process as very conservative, one which is designed to conserve things. There's this innovation happening, right? There's this error, and there's also maybe other forms of innovation. Do you have a way of measuring the degree of that balance, or rather this balance of that like, can we measure it independently, conservatism or, I guess, I don't know, innovation inside of a culture?
Yeah, well, so I have a graduate student, or not a graduate, he was a graduate student, now he's a postdoc, Max Winkler. So he's an economist. And so what he does is he takes data and he looks at, say, a whole bunch of reports on what the social norms are or what certain behaviors are. And he looks at how much people within a particular population report a deviant answer. And he uses this tightness and looseness, following people like Michelle Gelfand, the psychologist. So, I mean, that's kind of like what you're talking about in the sense that how you can say how tight a culture is.
Right.
How people report, is it okay to do this, to what degree, some scale response or something. So yeah, you can get that through these report measures.
And what might be the forces that dictate that? Like what causes the tightness or looseness of a culture? I hadn't actually mapped that onto this conversation. Think about that for a second, but I think we're coming at like, is there some precedent influence which kind of sets that slider to more conservative or not?
Well, so one of the ideas that I've tried to use to explain that is something called kinship intensity. So societies have families that are organized in different ways. And so, the families where I grew up and where many listeners probably grew up tend to be monogamous nuclear families. And people have to go out and make their own relationships and connect with others. But in other societies, lots of the ones across, at least the last 10,000 years of human history were what we call intensive. So they might have been polygynous, they had cousin marriage, there was lots of responsibilities and requirements, behavioral requirements, and they tend to be tighter because people are they're trying to avoid shame in a sense, and they're trying to go along and be conformist as a way of going along with the rules. The elders tend to have more power, so that makes things more conservative. People are having less interactions with non-members, with people that aren't in their social network, and that can lead to greater conformity and tightness. So a lot more monitoring of the rules, and you just get this. So I think it's due to this kinship structure. So that's one possible thing that'll affect tightness. Michelle Gelfand has argued, her and her colleagues, that also environmental shocks affect this. So places that are shocky, have earthquakes or storms or stuff, tend to be a bit tighter.
Right. It's interesting because I would have thought that a shock might force people to innovate a little bit. It depends on the source of it, I guess, because, I think of the story you told, and I don't remember which book it was now, but of a culture that observed the expansion of a neighboring ethnic group, and stole a whole bunch of their ideas, right? And it worked out pretty well for them, right? So there's a kind of shock there, which is not a natural disaster, but it's something else that actually probably, I mean, in some certain Big Bang sense, loosened them up. Is that the right way of thinking about it?
Well, I think in that case, they didn't actually innovate, at least in my definition. They copied.
Okay.
So they thought they were copying from a more successful group that was expanding militarily against another group. So that just galvanized, prestige-biased imitation. They didn't invent a whole new thing that wasn't, without precedent around them. So, and there's actually quite a bit of evidence that shocks may lead to greater tightness. So that same economist I mentioned, Max Winkler, has done detailed studies, and he shows that economic shocks, epidemiological shocks like pandemics, and weather shocks all create greater tightness in general in the norms.
Yeah, so I work in the insurance industry, and I have my whole career, and I've been kind of coming to terms with sort of I will use the non-capitalized version of the word weird, strangeness, let's call it, of the insurance industry. And I'm starting to come around. You actually, in reading your work, has been very important in this evolution of my own thinking on it, where let me kind of draw two kind of possible, I'll say it, primary applications of culture, or primary motivations for culture. So why do we have culture, right? And I think of like two big ideas. There's an idea of a development of like wealth creation or growth or enhancement of our livelihoods and the rest of that. And that's the economic growth side. And the other side of it is, which I'm distinguishing away from it, the prior one, of security and insurance, basically. And so what it seems, I wonder what you think about this. It seems to me that the insurance case is the primary case. So the first reason why cultures came about was to ensure survival. And there's a lot of interesting work on, and I don't know if you've read James Scott's The Moral Economy of the Peasant, but there's this idea of moral economies where they are not trading in dollars, they're trading in favors with each other. So it's very much a tight culture. It echoes a lot of ideas that I read in your works. And to me, that just like says, it has the insurance industry written all over it in a variety of ways. And so I see a lot of similar cultural features to call it subsistence farming cultures and the modern insurance industry, which is all about protecting ourselves from these unknowns, right, from these risks. And Scott's argument is, they're at the subsistence level, and so anything that's going to take them below that is a big problem. It's not just, I'm going to invest and incur some debt, and maybe I'll lose my investment, and so they actually have this reluctance to invest in themselves and generate economic growth. And so there's like really deep and very concerning trade-off in poorer societies where they're not willing to actually Michel Fafchamp, I don't know if you've heard of him, but he has a lot of interesting things to say about people at the subsistence level just aren't willing to actually adopt new things because they're just so worried about getting taken out next year from the next natural disaster or the next famine. So I'm wondering. So the question for you after that diatribe is the protection argument actually the original case for culture, even though most of your work is focused on the development side of things, which to me I think is just sort of a separate thing. What do you think?
Well, so. Just a semantic point would be that, so in my world, culture is just this socially learned information. So when chimps learn nutcracking from another chimp, that's culture. And there's lots of things like humans learn language, and that's culture. So learning, the grammatical rules or the meanings of words. I think the kind of thing you're talking about are institutions. So social norms, and especially things that benefit like some community. So yeah, I do think, that makes sense. I'm not sure how we would test it, but there's certainly widespread in lots of groups these risk managing institutions that are mostly about what happens when I get injured, shocked, or old, those kinds of things.
Yeah, the practice. So I could frame it in terms of practice. I completely obviously take your point there about the semantics. I think of like the applications of culture, the institutions that emerged earliest. That are most enhanced by culture were definitely ones that are there to stop people from dying, right? As opposed to looking for ways of accumulating wealth or they didn't want to change into I feel like people don't necessarily aspire to getting rich so much as they just want to protect themselves. I think there's like a fundamental urge maybe.
One of the other ideas, though, that's around, that traces to anthropology, and now some economists are working on it, is the notion that, at least in some, especially subsistence farming situations, there's this you end up in a zero-sum world where if most of your wealth is land, then you either have the land or you don't have the land. And so, assuming you have a fixed territory, then you're in a zero-sum world. And that tends to favor some of this kind of thinking that I think the authors you mentioned are talking about. You need something like either markets or technological innovation that gets you out of the zero-sum world.
Yeah, I mean, that is the result, at least the Fafchamp paper that I was referring to, where he talks about this sort of puzzle of the lack of adoption of innovation and subsistence economies. And his point there is, well, they're in this little tiny world where once you introduce markets that kind of reduce the price elasticity of a lot of goods, now they can trade away the surpluses and make lots of money, and they'll invest in cash crops. And so like the outside marketplace, the outside world market is actually, it's a great example of a way in which, freer trade can really enhance, just by having somebody else to trade with, expands the total, market for your stuff, which is a good thing.
I and others have argued that leads to, that if your culture is evolving in a zero-sum world, that leads to certain social norms, practices, and beliefs that can be a bit sticky.
Right.
So if you suddenly get deposited in a positive sum world, you're not a rational actor, so you don't immediately switch.
I think too about the kind of what's the direction this is sort of going in. It seems to me that the implicit, I want to call it value system of change is towards at least greater scale. I think of back to the example of those two societies we're talking about. The trigger for change and for the prestige, you mentioned the word prestige there. So the reason why they started thinking that this next culture beside them was so great was that they were expanding. And it seems to me that's like a kind of universal good. I don't know, maybe at least there's a survivor bias of those cultures we see are the ones that expanded. And so that is the end goal, right, of cultural evolution, is getting bigger. Is that right?
Well, that's one of the forces that's driving cultural evolution, is the way to think about it. So, one of the dynamics that I and my colleagues are interested in is that there's competition among social groups. And social groups that can maintain larger, more harmonious, and more cooperative groups, those cultural traits are going to have an advantage against others. Now, there's lots of reasons why they might still lose, and groups fall apart all the time. So there's nothing unilineal here, or could have long stretches where groups are just breaking down into smaller groups. But then there is this thing, because groups that are able to be larger and be more economically successful expand at the expense of others. We think that's a force in cultural evolution that explains a lot of traits.
Well, at the very least, it seems to me that is I even don't call it, it's not necessarily an explanatory variable, but that seems to me to be the force that describes the world as it is. Like, those are the cultures that expanded, and the ones that didn't expand got extinguished, and they're gone, right? So it's very powerful. And
it works not just through conquest and things like that, but it also works by groups copying more successful.
Sure, yes. Right, yes, they can just disappear by evolving themselves into a different culture. They assimilate.
So if you look at the spread of English, English
Sure.
is the widely spoken language in the world because the British were successful expansionists.
Yes, and copied, right? Exactly. And so I think on this point, you make an enormously convincing case about the Catholic Church being a source of acceleration for a lot of cultural evolution, introducing new psychological traits, which we can touch on. But to me, like the underlying forces at work didn't need that, right? So, and I wonder what you think about this. So, like, if expansion is the goal, and there's this prestige mechanism is kind of feeding back new innovations, even in the absence, it seems to me, of that kind of big bang, that acceleration, we may well have wound up with a lot of similar things we have today. Maybe not, today, but maybe a few hundred years later or something. I think of China in particular, which didn't have benefit of the Catholic Church, which is doing pretty well and continued to do pretty well. It might not have broken through kind of an industrial revolution sort of barrier, but maybe it kept accumulating things, right? So it to me is the development that we see today inevitable on sort of some time scale, or was there something incredibly special about, say, the Catholic Church changes, or was that just kind of like, maybe a little above trend for a while, but actually the trend was going that way anyway?
Well, it depends on there's a bunch of different ways to answer that question, because it depends how long the time scale is. So I think the key idea is the idea of path dependence. So the argument I make in The Weirdest People in the World is that the usual way that societies scale up to states is to have an intensive kinship system,
Yep.
and then to have a complex chiefdom, and then to have a state, which means that at the foundation you still have pretty complex kinship. And that's going to make it hard to build the kind of institutions that are common in the modern world today. So things like representative democracy and the kind of voluntary associations, firm competition that characterize the modern economy. And so what the Catholic Church did was kind of reset the kinship system to something very simple and force that part of Europe down a channel that wasn't common across human evolution. Now, I think, eventually, there would have been some other religion or some other mechanism that opened that avenue. We just don't know how long, the world would have waited for that avenue to get opened up.
If you make the point, I think mostly in The Secret of Our Success, but this idea of density of social interconnection being critical for innovation spreading across a culture, and the more people there are, the more likelihood one of them is going to have a good idea, and as long as you have a dense interconnection, that idea will spread, right? And so to me, that's a very powerful and very general force that's going to propel any human population in a particular direction, which is the direction to me of scaling and getting bigger. And so I think of nothing stops that. So it merely is a question of time before, it seems to me to be the path that we're on, maybe not the Catholic Church, as you say, maybe something else, but the rewards to the kinds of discoveries that the Catholic Church made implicitly in culture were always going to be there. And if they didn't pick them up, somebody else would have found out, maybe not all of it, maybe part of it, maybe even more of it than they did. But it just seems to me all be kind of pretty much inevitable. There's a crystal clear direction of change, and that we just got to see it play out.
Well, I think the thing to keep in mind, though, as you're laying that out, is this multiple equilibrium or the path dependence thing I mentioned before. Because think about technology. So one of the examples I sometimes use is bow and arrows versus blowguns. So once you have a really good blowgun, the first bow and arrow you're going to make is always going to be terrible relative to this highly refined blowgun you've evolved over centuries. So you're never going to switch to the bow, even if it's the better technology for the environment, because it would take so much work for you to make a bow, so many generations to get to a bow that's better than your best blowgun, that you're never going to want to go down that path. So one of the problems with the interconnected argument is that I think that's generally held through human history, but there is at least a theoretical argument that you could be too interconnected and you won't experiment with new pathways. So you kind of want, at least technologically speaking, and this could also be true of social institutions, you want some degree of independence because there's different ways to reconfigure things, and once you go far enough down a particular path, it's hard to, you can't unwind it. You're not going to be able to remake it. And so that's one thing to keep in mind. And relating to China, there really was a resetting in China. So in 1950, they began to adopt a bunch of the civil codes from the West, which included Western-style marriage. They ended uncle-niece marriage. They burned the genealogies. They had bilateral inheritance. They did a whole bunch of the things the Chinese state did from the top down that the church took 500 years to do. The communist government did it in 50 years. And the one-child policy. So one of the things people like to point out is that they didn't ban cousin marriage until 1980, but they imposed the one-child policy, which means if you don't have any siblings, you don't have any cousins. And so they solved that problem through a different mechanism.
Yet China was still I think you made the point, it was 200 million people or something there in the 1500s, and that was, you've in other forums, I guess, you've made the point that Jared Diamond's description of the world is fantastic up until about 1000 AD, right? So that seems to describe called the ecological forces that allow us, this sort of maximum ecological density, or density that ecological, prior conditions allow us. And that to me gives us sort of maybe a concept of a speed limit of innovation before any kind of serious culture takes us over. So, the maximum density you see in the world there with some distribution of culture institutions for, accepting innovation tight and loose, just sort of says, if it's, 0.1% economic growth a year, that's just what we're going to get until something, breaks through somewhere. Is that a way of thinking about Diamond's work?
Yeah, that sounds okay to me. I think that Diamond point is correct. I mean, Eurasia was always going to have a big advantage over the other continents, just because, as Diamond points out, the distribution of seed types and domesticatable animals, the size of the continent, the ability for China to share ideas with India, with Central Asia, the Mediterranean, and Europe. And there was lots of evidence for ideas moving across the continent, leading to technological evolution. Then, of course, there's the world religions all emerge in Eurasia, mastery or social technologies for scaling up societies. So yeah, that makes sense to me.
Hey, I want to come back to the idea of prestige and kind of the real basic fundamental psychology of this, where in the mimetic process, you have dominance and prestige, the two kind of ways that you can select your model for mimicking and for learning culture from, and maybe having it shoved down your throat, perhaps. And I wonder about kind of how that's evolved, because clearly, like, the prestige model is something that's fairly new, right? That's kind of incredible if you think about the magnitude of innovation at that level of fundamental level of our culture evolution process. Is that something that can happen again? Is prestige itself evolving?
Well, I mean, what seems to be clear from the cross-cultural record is that the domains of prestige, what makes one prestigious, can evolve. So you find immense variety in the things that one has to excel in. The main attribute that seems to distinguish things that can be prestigious is that not everyone can do it, right? It has to be a high variance domain where there's at least the appearance that people vary in skill in the domain. But actually, you don't need actual variance in skill. You need the appearance of skill variance. Some beliefs about that. So like people can be good at shamanism or something like that. Curing diseases using rituals or something like that. So that's the big thing that I'm interested in. In the longer run, like in terms of genetic evolution, so we haven't looked much into that.
So there's an economist named Robin Hanson, whom I read a fair bit, and he's got a real problem with the dominance prestige system as it exists, and prestige in particular, and he sees it as being a messy signal of what he would then call true value. So there's ways of cheating that, at least in the very, very short near term, right? So you can have people who are frauds who generate prestige for no good reason, right? You have errors in the prestige process. And I think he sees that as one of the things that is most fundamentally holding back another kind of acceleration of our development. And if only we could assign prestige in a more efficient manner, we might be able to unlock yet more positive, beneficial mimesis. What do you think about that?
Well, so yeah, I do think prestige goes quite awry in the modern world for all kinds of reasons, because our minds aren't calibrated to a world of media and of really large populations. So, anything from the diffusion of eating disorders to, people who can be famous for being famous just because a lot of people start paying attention, so more people start paying attention. Because we respond to what others are attending to.
Right.
One of the big cues we use. But, so that hasn't been around long enough for any interesting genetic evolution. And I don't see how that's going to get fixed. Well, maybe we'll figure out a way to fix it through cultural evolution. But no obvious candidates have popped up in my view.
Yeah, I just am awed in awe of the ambition of the question, right? And Robin's question of how might we tweak this feature of our cultural evolutionary process to make for better societal outcomes. Seems to me to be like a pretty tall order.
Yeah, it is, and especially do it in some kind of bottom-up way, because you could imagine having some state apparatus try to shape that, but that seems like they're going to have the wrong incentives. So.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, and there's a couple of sociologists who actually extend Peter Winch's work, the philosopher I was talking about earlier, Harry Collins and Robert Evans, who talk about expertise a lot, and they wrote a book on expertise, and they identify three different modes. This is much more analytically distinct, much more kind of philosophical than your definition of prestige. They don't even have prestige in their model. They say the three ways of identifying expertise are credentials, track record, and experience. They like experience, and this is a very Winchian kind of argument because quite explicitly so, because they say by immersing yourself in the culture of the domain of expertise, that's the only way to really get it. Right, so by being inside of it, learning the language, you can't be an anthropologist unless you've worked with anthropologists for 10 years, kind of thing, right? And so that's the right way to allocate this prestige is through kind of one of those three things. Robin Hanson likes the track record one, although I don't know that he is familiar with the work. And credentials is much more of a kind of a top-down thing, right? To your point there about top-down or bottom-up. So it seems like people are out there with ideas, but again, I just sort of don't really sure how we might even ever implement such an improvement. Do you think that is a plausible mechanism? So if you were to imagine ways of kind of beneficially nudging our cultural evolutionary process would that be one that would make sense to you, or would you pick something else?
No, I mean I think Robin's probably right about that. That strikes me as a pretty powerful piece of our cultural system. But I haven't spent any time thinking about it. But offhand, I can't think of any obvious public policy that one could implement that would help us with that.
So there's another kind of like, I don't know, a fractal kind of analysis of this, which to me, culture is sort of the big thing. And now an earlier question of yours helps me out here, because I was going to ask about subcultures, which are themselves kind of lesser organizations or subsets, and themselves can be more or less distinct, but don't really fit into this kind of the big picture of culture. How have you worked with subcultures and trying to measure diversity between, the differences between subcultures within a greater culture?
Well, let's see. I haven't done that per se, but within the framework that I've been describing, that's pretty straightforward in the sense that, we're not really imagining cultures as a noun, right? We are measuring distributions, and so if there's some cluster in there that shares a bunch of traits, that we call that a subculture. Now, they're going to share other traits with a more general, larger population that they're embedded in. They probably only vary along some subset of traits, and then it's just a matter of measuring those and figuring out what those are, and going from there.
You've worked in business schools, and to me, business and industry is an interesting kind of parallel universe of cultures and subcultures. What do you teach MBAs?
Well, the only time I've taught MBAs was I co-taught a course with the psychologist John Haidt, and we taught him some cultural evolution. So we were teaching about, because the social learning stuff that I've mentioned, where you learn from more prestigious people, or you match people on cues of similarity, like on sex or ethnicity, you watch what dialect they speak. All of these things are, really interesting from a business point of view, because it kind of tells you who people are going to pay attention to and who they're going to listen to. And then we've also talked about cooperation, so the central role of social norms. How do people learn social norms? Who do they pay attention to for that? How you can get maladaptive norms.
I think of culture as actually being, at least the word gets bandied about in the corporate world a lot, right? There's a saying which I really enjoy about business, which is culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So the identity of an organization actually is really what drives its operations, and all the decisions people make. And so culture is a point of obsession for a lot of organizations. And it's interesting to me that that there isn't more talk of this kind of thing, right? About the modeling of culture evolution and how we might feed. But so where my mind goes there is to think that maybe the process is just too small. We talked about timescales earlier, right? And I remember there's an interview I listened to yours where the interviewer was asking to make some predictions, and you said, I'm a cultural guy, ask me in 200 years, right? So if that's the timescales we're operating on, that's not really good enough to hit the earnings for next quarter or something, or even 5 years from now. So what do you think about the application of cultural evolution to, let's call it, building ideas in the near term, kind of within generational change? Is that applicable?
Well, it's applicable in the sense that it helps give you insights into the psychology. So, like I was mentioning, who people pay attention to for information. So one of the examples that I use in class is the British government was on a campaign around 2013, 2014 to try to get women to go in for genetic screening for breast cancer genes. And they were having limited success in getting people to go into it. And then Angelina Jolie wrote an op-ed in the New York Times in which she discussed her decision to get a double mastectomy, and this came from a screening. And that caused all the helplines and all the clinics to flood with women seeking to get the genetic screening that Angelina Jolie had discussed. So there's a case where prestige swamped all the government information dissemination programs.
Yeah.
They studied whether women knew more about this, and it had nothing to do with knowledge. Like, it wasn't like they said, let me read up on genetic screening.
Yeah, it was a pure manic explosion. Everybody started doing it. Yeah, that comes about in insurance a fair bit, that kind of thing. I spent some time selling health benefits insurance, and there's this category of like accident policies, right? And sure enough, I was talking to somebody who's done this for years. What happens when a celebrity breaks their leg in a ski run? It's like everybody buys it, right? Like not everybody, but a huge increase in the uptake of certain policies like this. It's temporary, and it's relatively speaking not big, but it definitely is detectable. So we are, so very driven for this, especially in areas where, like you say, we don't understand things as deeply. There's back to Mary Douglas actually for a sec. So one of the things that I learned reading her was that in situations of great uncertainty, the decision-making process, this is something that matters a lot in insurance, the decision-making process that you engage with is a social one. So you ask your people around you for help, and that becomes a political and then moral decision-making process. This is the chain that she lays out in one of her books. And that was very informative insight for me, because it explained a lot of kind of what I thought was strangeness inside the insurance industry. But it's interesting, like, she identifies a similar situation that you do in your work, where you say in situations of uncertainty, that's when our cultural decision-making process kicks in, right? That's when we look for people to say, related idea, but not the same thing. And I'm just wondering what you think about that. Is there a difference between using cultural knowledge and then going through a political process to make that decision? Do you understand what I mean there?
Yeah, I do. So, so our work, in going right back to the sort of earliest cultural evolutionary models, where you're looking at genetic and cultural evolution, suggests that under uncertainty, you should rely on cultural learning. And then there's certain kinds of cultural learning, like conformist transmission, that you would rely on, where you're copying the majority. But then I think what you're suggesting is, once you begin to do that social learning, you might find out there's social norms, or that people have evaluative judgments about certain choices, and then you're in a world where social norms matter. And I think that's what Mary's talking about, is that not only is there the informational aspect of it that says use social learning, but to the degree to which people have opinions about those who would make choice A or choice B, then you're in the moral domain.
It introduced, like, when I first read that, I thought to myself, politics. And I just kind of sat there for a second. I was like, that's really amazing, the use of that word here. And it made sense to me. The thing that and this kind of comes back to, you mentioned Jonathan Haidt, right? Comes back to his work, which is, we kind of hate politics, right? Politics is an unpleasant word. Like, that's not positive, right? It's a reality. We go through it. It's how we make decisions socially. We all get that. But man, did anybody like politics in the sense of, maybe you like the combative nature of it, but I don't know. I think most of us don't, right? We sort of hate politicians and all the rest of that. To me, it kind of invokes this concept of cultural norm enforcement isn't free or isn't conflict free, right? So we probably bristle against it. At least we do in weird societies. And that might be the source of the political force there, do you think?
Yeah. So at least one way that this has been described is when you're deciding what you're going to do, you're going to get vaccinated, you're going to wear a mask, you're also picking a team, or you're communicating what team you're favoring. Right?
Yeah. Which culture you're part of, perhaps.
Or
which of the moral foundations. And jumping back to the idea of business and kind of changing culture, the word got used again more recently, and there's a literature in economics about this change in intangible capital. I don't know if you follow any of this stuff, but what we're observing this really interesting trend in public markets, where the market value of companies is diverging from the book value. So the stuff that they write down on their balance sheet saying we have does not add up to anything close to how much we're valuing the companies for, right? So there's this intangible side to the capital that they're generating. And the word culture gets used a lot there in describing what we're really buying when you're buying such a company, and the decision-making process they have. And so there's this huge assignment of value, right, to cultures. And of course, one of the ways in which we measure that value is its ability to expand. What do you think about is that kind of making sense to you as an anthropologist, that we're focusing on the culture of these organizations and how it might change?
Yeah, it's kind of an informational good, right? So there's something in the complex of norms and ways of doing things that organization has, which the market price is saying, well, that has value, and we're going to put a number on it. Yeah. But
I want to talk.
Right? That culture could change, and then that could have no value.
Well, it can be destroyed. When I see in some organizations, when leadership changes, there can be a real deterioration in the decision-making process inside of an organization. This can happen in any institution, right? Where the culture will suddenly shift and in a negative direction. We see that kind of a little more dramatically than we see. It seems to me that there's like a fragility to culture, right? Particularly cultures which are, in a sense, good cultures. It seems like you change kind of one small thing, it can very easily collapse. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. It's certainly, I think it's empirically true.
Right. How would you measure that? I guess what is the incidence of cultural collapse in kind of
right? So these are kind of subcultures. So organizations are these subcultures where people have certain sets of values, but a lot of time those are shallow, and they could be set by the highly prestigious members of the organization. And if something happens to those individuals, or they fall from grace, or any number of things, then you could have an evaporation.
Is there? Can we tie this to maybe the historical record of cultures more generally? Do you have data on cultures rising and falling? Is there a way to measure the incidence of cultural collapse across a broader sweep of history?
Well, Peter Turchin, who's a kind of cultural evolutionist at the University of Connecticut, tracks the rise and fall of empires and other polities, political organizations through time, and there is definitely a life cycle, and they overexpand and then they crash from the middle, basically, because of internal squabbling. So success lays the seeds for their eventual internal struggles and collapse, right? And that just repeats itself. So that does seem to be at least a pattern in history.
But it seems to me that the more common source of collapse are the result of the expansion. So we measure the large empire because we could probably get a lot of data on them, but then they extinguished dozens, hundreds, I don't know, right? That seems to be a more common way, is to just get outcompeted. Do we have any idea for for if you sort of pluck our culture at random from all the history of all the different cultures? I know I'm using it as a noun, so apologies. But statistically, cultures, what percentage of them just get blown away by a giant, do you think?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Well, so one thing is they could be assimilated. So in the sense that they,
right.
They give some cultural diversity or some cultural variation to the group that politically assimilates them. So in that sense, their culture's not completely wiped out. But I mean, if you look at the expansion of human languages or the genetic data, it looks like human history is characterized by a series of expansions, right? So one group speaking a particular language expands at the expense of other groups. Sometimes genetically, sometimes there's more genetic mixing. But that's certainly a recurring pattern going far back, back into the Paleolithic.
Okay, a couple minutes left. I want to close on this concept of predicting the future, and I wonder if you could say whether you see any trends in our cultural change today. Confine it to Western societies, or however you like to. What are the things that are changing a little bit now, and how might those changes influence where you think our culture will go in the next 20, 200, 2,000 years? Like what do you think might happen?
Well, I'm not much of a future prognosticator. I mean, I do think there's a general trend towards greater individualism.
Yep.
I mean, there are counter trends to that, though, too. But this idea of breaking the world down into individuals who are endowed with lots of rights and lots of responsibilities. Even the nuclear family seems to be breaking down now. So that used to be the core unit, right? But now you can have children. You don't even need to get married, and make enough money, then that can work. So so breaking down to the individual seems to be a big thing.
So what does that mean? Like how does that affect cultural evolution?
Well, I mean, in this stuff that I'm interested in, like greater individualism, your psychology, more focus on your attributes and aspirations, less sense of community. So things like suicide rates increasing could be a problem, unless people can find other ways to get a sense of meaning. You need imagined communities for people to live in. At the same time, religion is declining, so you need, assuming that continues to decline, you would need some other imagined community for people to be part of, because we're so social, right? So we like to be individuals, at least in individualistic societies, but we don't like to be lonely.
But we still have, there still is a culture, right? And so I feel like one of the ways my mind went there when you're describing that was you're almost predicting the end of culture, because we're sort of losing we're losing the traditional channels through which it is transmitted. So it's coming from somewhere.
Learning from other people. So
how do we? It's just people on Instagram, and is that what think's going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, people seem to be able to learn from each other online. Although it's interesting, you don't learn everything online, so you don't seem to learn accents as much. So it all depends on the configurations. I mean, and this is just one trend. So there do seem to be other trends where, like, the U.S. is clearly fragmenting into, it's becoming more so. We've been looking at this data from John Haidt, where part of the country is becoming more morally parochial. And they're staying morally universalistic. So the country's getting further apart in terms of moral psychology. And that's affecting the politics and stuff. So we've linked the counties that are more morally particularistic, parochial, to voting for Donald Trump in both elections. And so that's obviously playing a role in our politics.
Have cultures, has there been schisms before inside of cultures that you've seen in the historical record?
Yeah, I think that's pretty standard. A standard pattern is the expansion of a big group, and then over time that big group breaks down into small parts and then fragments and fractures.
Right, so the subcultures become more dominant than the main culture.
But over time, the groups are always going to become more distinct. Now, in a world of social media, it's less clear because geography is less of a constraining factor.
Right.
Could become balkanized, but we're balkanized in a virtual world, and the physical geography is less important. Although, at least at this point, the physical geography still seems to assert itself.
Yeah, and yet at least physical geography still has a fairly strong influence on language and the like, right? And I think of, let's say, China or India, right, which are colossally populous places, right? I mean, it's unbelievable how many people are in those places. And we from over here, I don't know about you, but I don't really have a lot of insight into how granular the subcultures emerge there. Got to be, just because humans are humans, got to be pretty intense. You got to think that eventually some strain will emerge on the cohesiveness of those societies. Is that inevitability in your mind?
Well, yeah, unless there turns out to be cultural technologies that prevent that.
Really interesting.
Some ways of creating unified language, unified identity, similar values, and technologically maybe that is possible. But at this point, it's not jumping out at me. If you look at the cultural data, places like India and China are actually more, especially India, more culturally diverse than the U.S. by far.
Yep.
I was emphasizing the U.S. variation, but it's actually kind of mild compared to lots of other places.
Really, and this variation is, you're talking the measurements you were talking about earlier about checking whether people conform to certain cultural features.
Yeah, or you can take lots of questions about values on the World Values Survey, for example, and use that to look for differences between regions in the U.S. or something.
Is there something unusual that kind of cultural diversity might predict or be associated with in your mind? Like, what might surprise me about the consequences of that?
Well, there are these papers in economics which look at that and use it to predict violence, right? So more culturally similar places tend to trade more. They tend to have less civil wars, less violence, those kinds of things. So it's kind of the intuition of what you would think, right? So cultural similarity leads to interaction.
Right. Right. And then cultural differences lead to a very negative kind of interaction.
It doesn't mean violence has to occur, but as a statistical matter, it's more likely to.
Yeah, and there's been, I think, for the most part, a lot less. Well, I don't know. There was quite a lot more violence in the first half of the 20th century, and then it's really tamped down. I wonder if there's like a non-violent, catharsis that can occur to sort of, I don't know. Maybe that's going to be the most important thing that may or may not happen.
The decline of violence since World War II.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, no, I think those trends are real. My colleague Steve Pinker's written about this. So there is a broad, long-term decline of violence, and in particular since World War II. But there's that trend may or may not continue. We basically don't know.
Okay. My guest today is Joe Henrich. Joe, thank you very much for your time today.